Let's set the scene. The year is 1992. The Linux kernel was almost a year old, and Microsoft was dominating the tech landscape with Windows 3.0. This was the year the first SMS message was sent. It just said, "Merry Christmas." And soon, Intel would release their very first and very fast Pentium processor. And the Mosaic web browser would follow it and popularize the most basic version of what we know today as the Internet, pulling away from the currently popular way to interact with it called Gopher. But back to Linux. In the beginning, there was a kernel and a whole lot of things to do in order to bootstrap it and end up with some semblance of user space. This was until groups of hackers came together to make things a little bit easier. A couple of different free Linuxes sprang up. MCC Interim Linux, born in February in 1992, and Softlanding Linux System, born in August. There are others, but these are the important ones to this story. After rough starts with everything before it, most ended up with Softlanding Linux. And while it was the most popular at the time, it had plenty of bugs. It never made it out of the first half of the 90s. Those bugs, left unfixed, turned users of SLS into developers of their own systems. Other Linuxes came to be. Yggdrasil in December of 92, Slackware in July of 93, and another Linux on August 16th, 1993. Ian Murdock, a student at Purdue University at the time, announced his intention to make a new Linux release named Debian, all from scratch, not just another Softlanding Linux spin-off. The name was derived from his then-girlfriend, later wife's name, Deborah, and his own, Ian. Deb, Ian, Debian. Ian was the de facto first Debian project lead, and over the next few months, many releases from the first 0.01 to 0.90 were made available. And in January of 94, 0.91 released with software to allow users to install packages that existed at the time, but not much else. The Debian project was still small. Ian, as the Debian project leader, and dozens, not hundreds or thousands, of contributors. All with Ian still doing the bulk of the Debian release itself, including work on the very early stages of dpackage, the base of Debian package management. Later in the month, Ian releases the Debian Manifesto. In it, it says Debian is a brand new kind of Linux distribution, not intended to be run by a benevolent dictator for life or a group that would behave the same. Debian was to be run in the spirit of Linux and GNU, to be maintained by collective, unencumbered by profit or return, but still able to compete in a commercial world. Ian wrote, "The Debian design process is open to ensure that the system is of the highest quality and that it reflects the needs of the user community." And it all almost wasn't. Missed deadlines, broken promises, brought on by the same complications smaller distributions face today. You gotta eat. A full-time student with 2 part-time jobs left little time for hacking on Debian. Ian needed a break. He couldn't do it anymore. His current focus, version 0.92, still needed to be pushed out the door, but others would need to help it over the finish line. It never got there. Instead, there was an internal restructuring. Others needed and wanted to be able to contribute. And the answer to the wish Ian had expressed in his manifesto started to come together, thanks in part to Ian Jackson. In November, Richard Stallman's Free Software Foundation began paying Ian Murdock to help them create and release their very own GNU Linux system while cooperating with Debian. However, this deal came to a close when Ian separated himself from Debian further by stepping down as the first Debian project leader, ending his 3-year position in March of '96, leaving Bruce Perens to take up the job. Ian noted at the time, Bruce was the natural choice to succeed me, as he had been maintaining the base system for nearly a year, and he had been picking up the slack as the amount of time I could devote to Debian declined rapidly. But that would be the final straw for the FSF. Ultimately, the FSF lost control of the GNU Linux system being worked on, and Debian didn't want it either. It was likely all for the best, as a little later in '96, Bruce Perens, the Debian project leader at the time, noted that the other Debian collaborators would not have been very happy with Stallman's heavy-handed approach anyway, making good on another Debian Manifesto promise: collaboration. And in that spirit, soon after, Debian and the FSF resumed cordial relations. Fortunately for Bruce, but unfortunately for the manifesto, Bruce Perens was the benevolent dictator. Not for life, but for a while, until the upheaval of Ian stepping down and the FSF debacle can settle, and a board of directors can be elected. But rewind a little bit, and back in '95, Debian itself was still moving forward. Sidestepping 0.92, 0.93 saw public releases in March and November. The March release saw dpackage mature into something that would install and maintain all of the packages on the system. The November release, 0.93 Release 6, was always Ian Murdock's favorite, and was the last with his fingerprints. The rest of the community would take it from there. 1995 also saw the very first architecture port for Debian, the Motorola 68K family, in November. In '96 again, but before the much-anticipated Debian 1.0 release, one of the Debian CD manufacturers at the time mistakenly named one of the prior releases 1.0 instead. It was only partially in the executable and linkable format, ELF, and thus would likely not run. This created confusion in the community, and so it was decided to wholly skip 1.0 and continue versioning as if it had already been released. And on June 17th, Debian 1.1 is released, with the first ever code name based on Toy Story characters, at the behest of Bruce Perens, who was, at the time, a Pixar employee. It was named Buzz, after Buzz Lightyear, of course. Debian has not deviated from the naming scheme since. The Linux kernel 2.0, 474 software packages and dpackage to manage it all, including dependencies. There would be a stable release that attempted to freeze software versions, and a development release, a bit like the rolling releases of today. In December, Debian 1.2 is released, codenamed Rex, after the green dinosaur. Debian grew to 848 packages, all backed by 120 developers. It took a little less than a year, but on February 1st of '97, a board of directors had been elected for Software in the Public Interest, a nonprofit organization that managed the Debian project. 3 weeks later, Debian shows its intent to ratify a constitution, and finally, fully relieve Bruce Perens of the Debian reins, outside of the project leader position anyway. On June 5th, Debian 1.3 is released, codenamed Bo, after Bo Peep. Debian grew to 979 packages and 200 developers. And the next month, after a failed launch due to faulty fuel cells 3 months prior, Debian is really launched into space by NASA, this time to monitor plant growth in microgravity, sending video and other data back home. In 1998, July 24th, Debian 2.0 is released, codenamed Ham, after the piggy bank. Ian Jackson is the current project leader, elected in January, and looked over 1,500 packages and over 400 developers. In December, Debian finally ratifies that constitution. It defines the organizational structure of the Debian project and sets forth some rules for those within it. It also defines how and when elections happen and how subsequent appointments are made and how appointees can use their new powers. An updated version of this constitution is still in effect today. At the beginning of 1999, Ryniker Ackerman was elected Debian project leader and started with giving Debian a permanent identity. See, since the late 90s, the logo wasn't much of a logo at all. It was an uppercase Debian above a smaller GNU/Linux, all on top of a multicolored pastel shape. There was also another logo getting passed around, a red penguin with a blue eye. His name was Captain Blue Eye. But in January, the logo license for Captain Blue Eye, which had been temporarily extended again and again for a few months at a time, expired again. And there was discussion of replacing him altogether. In February, a logo contest announcement. It was all to be run at contest.gimp.org, which at the time ran some type of contest every single month. The winner of the contest was set to receive a Debian.org email address along with a CD set of Debian 2.1 Slink, if it released at all. But a month later, and after a 1-week delay, on March 8th, Debian 2.1 Slink, the contest prize, was released, named after the Slinky dog. Internal struggles and last-minute upgrade failures were to blame. But in spite of that, it added 2 more architectures, Alpha and Spark, and brought 2,250 packages spun onto 2 CD-ROMs sporting Linux kernel 2.0.36. It also officially brought apt, which had been in development for a year. It was also known as dpackage-get. In May, after a few false starts, the submissions were in. Ants, swirl, seal, fixed chicken, a stylized DG, and the old red penguin with a blue eye are proposed to go head-to-head to find a new logo. It was noted at the time that old Captain was too Linux-specific. And on June 8th, the iconic swirl that we see today won the vote. A few more votes, and 30 days later, the swirl officially replaced the red penguin, and the website made the swap soon after. In July, dpackage version 2, which was hinted at by Ben Collins back in May, is now officially a thing, and the specifications are out there boasting a more modular design. And to round out the year in December, merchandise shows up at copyleft.net. No shirts or hoodies, but a sweet evil swirl frisbee is up for grabs. Debian, like most other companies, weathered the Y2K storm with no major problems. A few more minor bugs and things like NTP date and birthday left to fix, but nothing serious. Later in 2000, Ryniker Ackerman was re-elected Debian project leader. And in July, DebConf 0, the first ever DebConf, was held in Bordeaux, France. Its aim was to allow developers to talk and collaborate in person, like every other DebConf after. In August, Debian 2.2 is released, codenamed Potato, after Mr. Potato Head. It brought along PowerPC and ARM architectures on kernel 2.2.19 and 3,900 binary packages by 450 developers. It also introduced GNOME at version 1.0.56, or should I say at the time, GNOME.
Mm-hmm.
This release was dedicated to Joel Espy Klecker, who sadly passed away before the release. He was fighting disease during most of his Debian involvement. The rest of the year 2000 went off without much trouble, except for removing non-free. As John Gorzin puts it, non-free software is no longer an essential or standard part of a typical installation. This assertion went about as well as it would today, which is to say, lots of discussion and no real movement. In November, the resolution to remove non-free fizzled out. In December, since 2.2 was released and going and sights were set on 3.0 with over a year's lead time, the testing distribution is set up for the first time to stage changes that would eventually become Debian 3.0. Another year, another election. Ben Collins was voted Debian project leader on March 29th, 2001. In June, Debian suffered from an outage at master.debian.org. The cause was hard drive problems. And the effect was no bug tracking, no email, no mail archives, and a few other services. The downtime was less than a week and sparked discussions about eggs and baskets. In October, folks over at Land Comp Systems began mastering Debian 3.0 on DVD ahead of the official release. This is still when 4 more CDs are required to get Debian going. It was a rough year. It took them a bit longer to push out 3.0 than was originally expected. A big part of that was broken boot floppies. With no booting, that meant no installation testing. And without that, development would fly blind. It was a priority. Early in the year 2002, the first net installation images were available. Much smaller than the multiple 650 megabyte Debian installation media CDs, but it's only for those with decent internet connections, as most of the system is downloaded. In April, Badale Garby wins the Debian project leader election. And in July, he oversaw the Debian 3.0 release, codenamed Woody, after the toy sheriff. It brought working boot floppies and new architectures too. IA64, HP PA RISC, MIPS, big and little, and S390. It was also KDE's debut in Debian at version 2.2 after about 10 months of testing. All with kernel 2.2.20. 8,500 packages maintained by over 900 developers. On March 29, 2003, Martin Michelmeier was elected Debian project leader and served for 2 years. And in August, Debian celebrated its 10th birthday. In 2005, and with the lowest election turnout ever, Brandon Robinson was elected Debian project leader. He was able to oversee Debian 3.1, released on June 6th, codenamed Sarge, after the toy soldier. No new architectures this time, but it does come with GNOME 2.8, KDE 3.3, over 9,000 new packages, along with 6,500 updated packages, and quite a few removals too. It used Linux kernel 2.4.27 and alternatively kernel 2.6. This release also includes the addition of the first Office suite in Debian, OpenOffice.org 1.1. Aptitude is now the preferred package manager as it could handle dependencies better than apt at the time. And finally, the Debian installer, an early version of what is seen today by default, is added. In 2006, Anthony Towns was elected Debian project leader, succeeded by Sam Hokovar in 2007. Sam was able to oversee the release of Debian 4.0 on April 8th, codenamed Etch, after the Etch-a-Sketch, and unofficially in Sarge, but officially in Etch, AMD 64 architecture is here, supporting both Intel and AMD processors. And the first added architecture becomes the first dropped. The Motorola 68K architecture is no more. Etch added 6,500 new packages, bringing the total to more than 18,000, all on kernel 2.6.18. This includes XFCE 4.4, and Compass also shows up and brings the wobble. And starting in Etch, Mozilla Firefox, out for just a couple of years so far, through a disagreement with Mozilla on backporting security fixes, would be replaced by the free software version Iceweasel. Finally, the Debian installer got its first graphical user interface. Steve McIntyre was elected the DPL in 2008 and served for 2 years. In 2009, he was able to oversee the Debian 5.0 release on February 14th, codenamed Lenny, after the binocular toy. It brings ARM EL support, 7,700 new packages for a total of over 13,000. Over 3,100 packages were removed since Etch. In addition to kernel 2.6.26, a new desktop, LXDE, arrives. Also for the first time, free versions of Java show up, allowing Java applications in main. And Debian Live is available for AMD 64 and i386 architectures. This means you can boot from the media without the need to install and still run a full session. Stefano Zaccaroli in 2010 was elected Debian project leader and would serve 3 years. He was able to oversee the Debian 6.0 release on July 19, 2011, codenamed Squeeze, after the three-eyed space aliens in the claw machine. The time-based freezes Debian users are familiar with show up in this release. This led Squeeze to be the first version to carry long-term support, and that support lasted for over 5 years. HP PA RISC, Alpha, and the deprecated ARM architectures were dropped. The release brought over 10,000 new packages for a total of over 29,000, all on kernel 2.6.32. This is the release that introduced the infamous KDE4 to Debian. In this release, there was also experimental support for a free BSD kernel, making Debian the first Linux distribution to allow use of a non-Linux kernel. In 2013, Lucas Nasbaum was elected Debian project leader and would serve 2 years. He was able to oversee the Debian 7 release on May 4th, codenamed Wheezy, after the penguin with the red bow tie. And you may have heard the trailing 0 on the major release. It's dropped. Minor releases will continue adding the point, as in 0.1, 0.2, etc. 7 added the S390X and ARM HF architectures, and introduced multi-arch support, allowing things like 32-bit and 64-bit binaries on the same system. This would also, hopefully, allow for live migrations from 32-bit to 64-bit systems. Over 2,000 new packages for a total of over 37,000, all on kernel 3.2. This is also the release that introduced the all-new and very controversial GNOME 3. In 2015, Neil McGovern was elected Debian project leader. He was able to oversee Debian 8, released on April 26th, codenamed Jessie, after the cowgirl. This was a controversial release as it came bearing System D. But it wouldn't be Debian if sysvinit and upstart packages weren't still floating around, ready to be used. The older S390 architecture was dropped along with IA64 and Spark, but ARM64 and PowerPC 64EL were added. Over 12,000 new packages, which brings the total to over 43,000, all on kernel 3.16. Jessie is the first version of Debian to promise a full 10 years of long-term support. As an aside, those 43,000 binary packages span 10 DVDs, or 85 CDs, This would be the last release to offer CDs as an option. If you wanted the source to, it would be an additional 10 DVDs, or an additional 59 CDs. For those of you keeping track at home, that's a grand total of 144 CDs. In 2016, Mehdi Dugi was elected Debian project leader, succeeded by Chris Lamb in 2017, and Chris would serve 2 terms. He was able to oversee the Debian 9 release on June 17th, codenamed Stretch, after the toy octopus. It added the MIP64EL architecture and dropped PowerPC, and i386 is adjusted to mean i686 and more modern CPUs, with a few exceptions. KDE 4 is updated and migrated to KDE Plasma, now at version 5.8. And the Mate desktop is now also officially supported. More than 15,000 new packages for a total of over 51,000, including kernel 4.9. This release also makes MariaDB the default database over MySQL. This was a big change that was a long time coming since Oracle bought MySQL back in 2009, and the original developers forked the project. Installing Fresh also pushed the change to the naming scheme for network interfaces from the old ETH to ENS and ENP. In 2019, Sam Hartman was elected Debian project leader. He was able to oversee the Debian 10 release on July 6th, codenamed Buster, named after the main character's dog. This release sees the adoption of the Rust programming language by including things like FD and EXA, as well as a return of Firefox. More than 8,000 new packages brings the total to around 59,000, all on the 4.19 kernel. Debian now supports things like driverless printing, a Wayland GNOME session, the merged USR, and Secure Boot. LXQT is also officially added to the lineup alongside LXDE. In 2020, Jonathan Carter was elected Debian project leader and has been reaffirmed 3 more times and is currently serving as leader. He'll be up for re-election again in 2024. But in 2021, August 14th, Debian 11 is released, codenamed Bullseye, after Woody's horse. 11,000 new packages, alongside some removed, keeps the total at about 59,000. The kernel is upped to 5.10. The controversial move, as with all things systemd, to enable systemd's persistent journaling in Varlog Journal is made. But sysvinit and OpenRC are still officially supported. Also, exFAT support is now baked into the kernel. In 2023, Debian 12 is released in June, codenamed Bookworm, after the green worm with glasses and a flashlight. No new architectures were added or removed, but i386 support was updated to slightly newer hardware. Debian is now one of the extremely select set of distributions that support 32-bit. Slackware is another. Around 11,000 new packages for a grand total of more than 64,000, all running on kernel 6.1. And after many battles back and forth regarding non-free firmware, Debian finally reaches the conclusion that adding it is in its best interest. So the Debian social contract was amended to include this fact. And a few days before this recording, Debian 12 Bookworm got its first point release. Now, looking ahead, sometime in 2025, usually mid-year, Debian 13 Trixie, the Triceratops, will be released. And in 2027, Debian 14 Forky, the arts and crafts fork toy, will be released.